History often hides its most terrifying truths behind polite titles and forgotten names. But in the winter of 1035, England fell under the rule of a young king, whose pursuit of power unleashed a quiet, calculated brutality unlike anything the realm had seen. His victims did not die on battlefields. They disappeared in corridors, in monasteries, in the dead of night. This is the story of Harald Harefoot, the king who killed without spectacle and ruled through fear no one dared speak aloud. The winter of 1035 fell over England like a heavy cloth, muting color, stifling movement, and casting a pall over every hall from Wessex to York. King Canute was dead, and the kingdom he forged from conquest and uneasy compromise fractured the moment his body turned cold. England, already exhausted from decades of invasion and political reshaping, now faced a far subtler threat, a throne divided by lineage, loyalty, and the ambition of those who sensed opportunity in chaos. Two heirs stood at the center of the storm. Harthacnut, Canute's legitimate son by Emma of Normandy, ruled Denmark and was expected by many to inherit England as well. But he was far away, locked in conflict with Norway and unable to cross the sea. The other claimant, Harald Harefoot, was present in England, yet he carried the stain of questionable legitimacy, a whispered defect that followed him like a shadow. His mother, Ælfgifu of Northampton, was accused by some of forging birth claims, manipulating documents, and persuading pliable witnesses to secure her son's acceptance as a royal child. Though never openly proved, such doubts hardened into political conviction. The English nobility split quickly. Some feared instability more than questionable lineage, believing Harald, young though he was, could offer continuity while Harthacnut remained distant. Others refused to bend, asserting that a king must be legitimate or he was nothing more than a usurper. The tension moved quietly at first, rewritten oaths, changed seals, meetings held in unlit upper rooms of mead halls where voices never rose above a whisper. Wessex leaned toward Harthacnut, Mercia drifted toward Harald. The church found itself uncomfortably in between, wary of backing the wrong prince. Such divisions rarely remain bloodless. In the first weeks after Canut's burial, minor thegns across the countryside vanished without explanation. Some were later found lifeless near roads or riverbanks, their deaths attributed publicly to robbers but privately to political reprisal. No one could trace the orders, but everyone sensed intent behind the killings. A climate of hostility settled over England, unspectacular yet chilling, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Harald, still mostly silent in council chambers, revealed early glimpses of the composure he would weaponize later in his reign. He neither shouted nor pleaded for support. Instead, he listened, he watched. He learned who hesitated before speaking, who avoided eye contact, who offered their allegiance too quickly. Even his own allies felt unsettled by his calm, which seemed less like restraint and more like calculation. In private meetings, he spoke firmly of the need for unity, yet beneath his words lay an unmistakable warning: England must not stand leaderless. By late autumn, with Harthacnut still absent, pressures from nobles loyal to Ælfgifu and from regions unwilling to wait longer tipped the balance. A council was held, tense, incomplete, and marked by quiet resentment. In this gathering, not universally attended nor universally accepted, Harald was proclaimed regent. Not king, not yet, but the distinction mattered less than it appeared, for power once seized rarely loosens its grip. Weeks later, in an understated ceremony devoid of triumph, Harald was crowned king. The procession was thin, the chant subdued, the mood unmistakably divided. Those present felt it. The air carried the sense that something irrevocable had begun. The coronation did not resolve the struggle, it merely shifted it into a darker register. Harald Harefoot took the throne with a promise unspoken but understood, that he would secure it by any means necessary, and in the shadows of the kingdom, those who opposed him braced for what would come. Months after Harald's contested coronation, the cold unease gripping England began to settle into a deeper fear. The court whispered of shadows gathering beyond the Channel, for word had reached London that Alfred Aetheling, long exiled son of Ethelred, was preparing to return. His journey was framed as a pilgrimage of reconciliation, yet everyone understood it for what it was, a claim to a kingdom already cracking. Alfred was no reckless youth seeking glory. He traveled with a modest retinue, guided by advice from Norman allies who believed England might receive him as a rightful heir. But neither he nor his companions understood how thoroughly the political climate had changed. Those who once supported the House of Wessex were now hunted, silenced, or bound to Harold through fear rather than loyalty. When Alfred's ship approached the Kentish coast, the shoreline appeared still, almost welcoming. Local nobles came forward offering formal greetings and assurances of safety, but their courtesy hid an unease that Alfred sensed too late. These men owed their positions to a king desperate to secure every advantage. They knew Harold feared rivals most when they arrived quietly, without armies or banners. The nobles subtly steered Alfred inland, insisting that London, divided and restless, was unsafe. They spoke of escorting him to Winchester, where neutral ground supposedly awaited. Yet each diversion moved him farther from traditional centers of Wessex support and deeper into territories now controlled by Harold's most unwavering allies. The Aetheling followed their guidance, unaware that every step narrowed his options. Along the roads of Kent and Surrey, Alfred's retinue began sensing the shift in tone. Escorts multiplied. Riders joined and departed without introduction. Messages were exchanged out of earshot. Alfred questioned the purpose of their rerouted path, but the nobles answered with gentle reassurances that sounded increasingly rehearsed. Travelers at roadside inns later recalled the prince's men whispering of misdirection, though none dared warn him openly. The turning point came near Guildford, where sudden hospitality replaced caution. Alfred and his companions were invited to lodge in a fortified estate said to belong to a loyal noble sympathetic to all royal bloodlines. The doors closed behind them with courteous ceremony, but the retinue later remembered the heaviness of the bolts, the guarded passages, and the way servants avoided their eyes. That night, armed men entered the estate under the pretext of increasing security. Their movements were deliberate, their silence practiced. Alfred's men realized the truth only when detachments split the group, escorting some to the stables, others to upper chambers. No overt violence occurred. Instead, a calm, methodical separation was imposed, the kind used by authorities determined to prevent coordinated resistance. By dawn, Alfred understood the depth of the betrayal. There was no escape route, no allies waiting beyond the estate walls. The nobles who had courteously guided him vanished before sunrise, replaced by soldiers operating under orders that required neither explanation nor justification. The prince was informed he would be brought before the king's council, a phrase that carried more threat than promise. His retinue, loyal yet powerless, faced confiscation, interrogation, and removal. Some attempted protest, others fell silent, recognizing the danger of defiance. The machinery of Harold's rule had quickened, functioning with a precision that suggested either direct instruction or an eager interpretation of his will. In this period, silence served the king better than proclamations, for unspoken demands bred broader obedience. Alfred's capture marked a quiet turning point, sealing his fate within Harold's grasp forever. The capture of Alfred Aetheling sent a muted tremor through England, but it was in Guildford that the tremor deepened into dread. Held under guard in a fortified residence, Alfred and his retinue waited for clarity that never came. No formal charges were read. No council summoned. Instead, messengers arrived and departed with unsettling frequency, their expressions fixed in unreadable calm. The silence surrounding the prince's presence felt engineered, as though the entire operation depended on keeping his fate hidden from the broader realm. Harald Harefoot's court insisted later that the prince posed grave danger, claiming he intended to seize command of English boroughs. Yet no evidence was produced, and even Harold's allies struggled to justify the measures that soon followed. Historians note that this period marks a shift in the king's governance, from tentative authority toward the colder, calculated resolve that would define the rest of his reign. Harald understood that a rival's survival, even under confinement, could fracture the fragile allegiance he was fighting to hold together. In Guildford, the soldiers assigned to Alfred conducted their duties with rigid formality. They offered no cruelty in gesture or tone, yet their compliance with unspoken orders demonstrated the power of fear within Harald's ranks. Each man acted as if deviation, however minor, carried its own sentence. The prince attempted to speak with them, hoping for information or sympathy, but most responded only with respectful evasions. They were instruments, not decision-makers, and they knew it. When the order finally arrived, it came not from a public decree, but through a sealed command carried by a royal agent. The document itself remains lost to history, but accounts preserved in monastic chronicles and later testimonies suggest its meaning was unmistakable. Alfred was to be rendered harmless, not killed, not yet, but stripped of any possibility of future rule. In Anglo-Saxon political culture, there existed punishments that removed a man's suitability for kingship without ending his life, and these were favored when shedding royal blood risked spiritual condemnation. The soldiers who escorted Alfred from his chamber maintained an outward discipline, but witnesses later described the heir as charged with the terror of both victims and captors. Alfred's followers, kept in adjacent rooms or outbuildings, were taken in smaller groups, each man separated to prevent resistance or collective defiance. Their protests were urgent but controlled. They knew that raising their voices too loudly could provoke harsher reprisals. What transpired in the following hours remains one of the darkest episodes recorded from Harald's reign. Historical sources confirm that Alfred and many of his companions were subjected to mutilation, a method of punishment intended to eliminate political threat by rendering a man symbolically and physically incapable of kingship. Chroniclers refrained from detailed description, but their tone conveyed the enormity of what occurred. The act was not spontaneous nor chaotic, it was systematic, carried out with procedural severity. What distinguished the Guildford event was not simply the punishment itself, but the way it unfolded with a disturbing absence of spectacle. There were no crowds, no proclamations, no display of authority. Everything happened behind walls, executed by men fulfilling obligations they dared not refuse. In this concealment lay a deeper menace, a state willing to commit atrocities quietly, fearing only the noise they might make, not the moral weight of the acts themselves. By the time Alfred was delivered into monastic custody at Ely, he was weakened beyond recovery. The monks who received him documented his condition with sorrowful restraint, noting only that he had suffered harm, grievous and unkingly. Word of the deed traveled across England as a whisper rather than a shout, but its effect was profound. A line had been crossed, not publicly, but definitively. From this moment forward, Harald's rule would be remembered not for governance or policy, but for the quiet precision of its cruelty. Ælfgifu of Northampton moved through the royal household like a quiet current beneath deep water, seldom noticed, never ignored, and always felt. Those who served in the corridors of Harald's court learned early that her silence carried more force than most nobles shouting. She had survived the political labyrinth of two rival dynasties, outlived enemies sharper than any blade, and raised a son to kingship in a world where misplaced loyalty could end a bloodline. No one doubted that she understood power more intimately than the king himself. Though official documents rarely named her in state affairs, her influence lingered behind every decision Harald made. Council members arriving for morning consultations often found her already present, seated near the hearth with an embroidery frame she scarcely touched. She did not interrupt discussions, she merely listened, her expression unreadable. Yet by evening, proposals once considered firm became flexible, and plans for restraint transformed into demands for severity. Courtiers whispered that the king's judgment shifted whenever she spoke to him alone. Ælfgifu had learned the harsh mathematics of survival long before Harald's ascent. Her own claim to royal motherhood had been challenged in the past, with rival factions accusing her of manipulating genealogies to elevate her sons above competing heirs. Some churchmen murmured that charters bearing favorable lineage claims showed signs of suspicious amendment. These accusations never reached formal inquiry. They vanished as quietly as the men who first voiced them. Whether the rumors were truth or slander mattered little. What endured was the understanding that Ælfgifu defended her son's position with unbending resolve. Within her private chambers, she counseled Harald with a steadiness that bordered on chilling. She reminded him that kingship was not a birthright, but a prize that others plotted to reclaim. Her voice stayed soft, almost tender, when she spoke of enemies. The gentleness made her warnings unnervingly persuasive. She never commanded him directly. Instead, she asked questions that lodged themselves inside his mind like seeds that sprouted into fear. Had Alfred's arrival truly been coincidence? Could the nobles be trusted when their loyalties drifted with the winds of opportunity? Would mercy today not become weakness tomorrow? Harald, already burdened by insecurity, found comfort in her certainty. He listened more intently to her than to any priest or advisor, and gradually her philosophy merged with his own, that a king who hesitated invited ruin, and a ruler who showed leniency carved his own downfall. The line between caution and cruelty thinned with every whispered conversation. Rumors soon circulated that Ælfgifu had played a hidden role in Alfred Aetheling's fate. No evidence survived, no letter or confession, yet many believed she had pressed Harald to act decisively against his rival. Some said she had warned him that the nobility would abandon him if Alfred remained alive. Others insisted she merely reminded him of England's unforgiving memory, that once a rival heir returned, the realm rarely forgot the lineage he represented. These whispers flourished precisely because nothing was proven. Even those close to her could not decipher her true stance. She spoke of Alfred only once in passing, remarking that the realm cannot bear two sons, a phrase servants repeated in hushed tones long after. Whether it was prophecy, cruelty, or simple observation remained unknown. What was clear was Harald's transformation. The young man who once sought compromise now adopted his mother's colder methods. He reviewed petitions with narrowed suspicion, dismissed long-trusted servants for minor slights, and responded to dissent with swift punishment. The court noticed the shift and adjusted accordingly, moving with greater caution and fewer questions. Ælfgifu did not celebrate these changes. She merely watched, her expression measured, as her son embraced the ruthless doctrine she had shaped. And though no one could officially name her as an architect of England's growing fear, all understood that Harald's path was no longer his alone. It was hers as well. By early 1037, London carried the uneasy stillness of a city holding its breath. Merchants opened their stalls with forced calm. Mothers hurried their children indoors before dusk, and the tolling of church bells no longer signaled prayer alone, but warning. Harald's rule, once dismissed by many as temporary, had hardened into something far more enduring and far more dangerous. The king no longer sought legitimacy through counsel or diplomacy. He now sought it through fear. The first wave of punishments began quietly, almost methodically. Royal messengers delivered sealed orders to local reeves, who in turn assembled makeshift courts in taverns, guild halls, or open marketplaces. The law had always permitted stern consequences for treachery, but under Harald the boundaries shifted. Suspected disloyalty alone justified the harshest penalties. A word overheard at a feast, a delay in sending taxes, an absent bow during the royal procession. Any of these could be interpreted as rebellion. The law codes of earlier kings had prescribed mutilation for certain crimes, yet those punishments were typically reserved for grave offenses. Under Harald, they became routine. Hands were severed from minor nobles accused of concealing alliances. Harald argued that removing their right hand rendered them incapable of raising arms against him. The reasoning was technically lawful, but the frequency was unprecedented. Witnesses described small groups of condemned men escorted to wooden blocks, their faces pale, their families begging for clemency. Few pleas reached the king, and none were accepted. Tongue removal, once reserved for habitual oath-breakers, resurfaced as a favored penalty. Those suspected of spreading rumors about Alfred's death found themselves dragged into public squares, forced to kneel as clerics recited perfunctory blessings over them. The process itself was swift, but its aftermath spread terror more effectively than any proclamation. A man silenced permanently became a living warning. The sight of such victims walking through the markets, communicating only with gestures, turned conversation into a dangerous act. Neighbors avoided speaking at all in the presence of strangers, unsure who might report them. Entire families suffered under the revived practice of outlawry. When a thegn refused to swear renewed loyalty to Harald, his household was declared beyond the peace. This sentence did not kill them, but it exiled them into a winter that could. Stripped of land, protection, and legal standing, these families trudged toward the countryside carrying what little they could salvage. Some never reached the next village. Others were refused shelter by terrified farmers who feared taking in the king's exiles. Those who survived the season became wandering reminders that opposition to Harald meant erasure. The king witnessed only fragments of this suffering. Reports filtered to him through reeves eager to prove their obedience, and he interpreted each story as validation that he now commanded unquestioned authority. In council meetings, Harald spoke of restoring discipline to a kingdom fractured by uncertainty. He framed every sentence delivered as a necessary measure to secure stability. Yet beneath the seemingly rational explanations lay a darker truth. Cruelty had become easier for him. What once required justification now required none. London's people understood this long before the nobility dared to acknowledge it. They spoke in low tones of Harald's new reputation, a name whispered behind shuttered windows and during hurried midnight walks, Harald the Pitiless. No official chronicler recorded the title, yet it clung to him as firmly as any crown. It was not simply a judgment, it was a survival tactic. Naming him aloud in daylight risked punishment. Naming him in private allowed the city to share its fear. By winter's end, the capital had transformed. Justice had become performance, mercy an illusion, and every Londoner knew that the king's wrath no longer distinguished between the guilty and the merely unfortunate. The punishments had achieved their purpose. Silence had become London's second language. In the shifting landscape of Harald Harefoot's fragile monarchy, no figure loomed larger nor more dangerously than Godwin, Earl of Wessex. He was a man whose loyalty had bent with the winds of power for decades, a survivor of 3 reigns, and a political force capable of shaping the destiny of England with a single calculated gesture. Harald understood this from the moment he ascended the throne. Godwin's allegiance was useful but never guaranteed, and in a court built increasingly on suspicion, usefulness alone was no longer enough. Their alliance had always been a marriage of necessity. Godwin, pragmatic to the bone, had initially supported Harald's bid for the throne, offering the weight of Wessex in exchange for continued influence. But the coronation had not eased the tension between them, it had amplified it. Harald sensed that beneath Godwin's courteous words and carefully measured bows lay contempt, the kind that no king could afford to overlook. Godwin's presence at court carried the quiet thread of history. He had once served Canute loyally, later tolerated Emma, and now tolerated Harald only because it suited him. Harald began planting spies in the Earl's household long before he admitted it to his closest advisors. Messengers routed through back alleyways, stable hands trained to overhear whispers, even a young clerk assigned to copy Godwin's correspondence. Each was instructed to note every unusual visitor, coded phrase, or change in routine. Harald insisted these precautions were merely protective, but the truth was simpler. He feared Godwin because he could not control him. The information that trickled back was rarely incriminating. Godwin's household was vast, full of distant relatives, priests, warriors, and petitioners seeking favor. Yet the king found paranoia in the mundane. When Godwin hosted a quiet dinner with several thegns from Kent, Harald interpreted it as conspiracy. When the Earl attended Mass at St. Paul's, Harald questioned whether the bishop whispered foreign promises into his ear. And when a ship from Flanders docked near London, Harald demanded to know whether Godwin had sent word to Harthagnet's supporters abroad. The pressure grew insidiously. Harold's agents began interrogating Godwin's servants, sometimes under the pretense of tax inquiries, sometimes under no pretense at all. Rumors of these interrogations spread throughout London, and Godwin finally understood what the king was shaping: a narrative, a preemptive justification for whatever punishment he deemed necessary. Yet Godwin did not withdraw. Cautious though he was, he continued to maintain discreet contact with Harthacnut's loyalists. Not overt treason, he knew the stakes too well, but subtle acknowledgments carried through church envoys and merchants. He was hedging his survival, preparing for the possibility that Harold's reign might collapse as quickly as it had risen. Harold eventually decided that a message needed to be sent. But he was not yet ready to confront the Earl directly. Instead, he targeted those around him. Thagnans, known to be aligned with Godwin, were summoned to London under the guise of clarifying oaths. What awaited them were accusations shaped from fragments of truth, half-truths, and interpretations tailored to justify a predetermined verdict. Several were imprisoned, others were fined so heavily their estates suffered lasting ruin. The strategy was unmistakable. Harold was tightening a noose around the Earl's circle, hoping Godwin would lash out or flee, either of which would confirm guilt in the public eye. But Godwin did neither. He swallowed the insult, publicly reaffirmed loyalty, and waited. This uneasy dance between king and earl marked a dark evolution in the kingdom. Rebellions no longer needed swords. They could be born from glances, prolonged silence, or imagined threats. And Harold, increasingly governed by fear rather than strategy, was drifting toward the kind of ruler who would punish shadows simply because they resembled foes. By the year's end, their alliance remained intact in name only. What bound them together now was not trust, but mutual recognition that betrayal, once it finally came, would not be an act of impulse, it would be inevitable. Northumbria had always been a land apart, a frontier that neither kings nor conquerors ever fully tamed. Its moors and river valleys carried memories of older loyalties, hidden English clans, lingering Danish settlers, and bishops who answered more to their local customs than to any southern crown. For Harald Harefoot, already tightening his grip on the throne through fear, this ancient independence felt like a direct challenge. And in the months following Alfred Aetheling's mutilation, whispers from the north reached London with an urgency that fed his deepening paranoia. Reports spoke of gatherings in remote halls, of nobles muttering that Harold was unfit to rule, of churchmen openly praying for Harthacnut's return. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by frightened informants or deliberately manipulated by courtiers seeking favor did not matter. Harold accepted them as truth. He declared, quietly and without formal proclamation, that the North needed to be disciplined. But discipline, in his vocabulary, no longer meant negotiation or taxation. It meant removal, quiet, permanent, and untraceable. He chose not to send large armies, knowing such displays bred rebellion. Instead, he dispatched small bands of loyal warriors, carefully selected from men who owed their fortunes to him alone. They traveled under darkness, avoiding major roads, dressed in muted cloaks that concealed their royal affiliation. Their mission was simple: identify suspected dissidents and ensure they did not live long enough to inspire others. The first attacks occurred along the River Tees. A minor Theg known for praising Harthacnut at feasts was found dead near his cattle pens, his body arranged to appear like a drunken fall. Days later, a priest who had questioned the legitimacy of Harold's coronation vanished during evening prayer. His corpse surfaced downstream 3 days later, tangled in reeds. No one claimed responsibility, and no message accompanied the deaths. Yet everyone understood what they signaled. By winter, an atmosphere of dread had settled across Northumbria. Villagers learned to read the silence of the night. If dogs did not bark, it meant riders moved with practiced stealth. If torches did not appear along the road, it meant the hunters had already chosen their target. Women bolted their doors, men slept with knives under blankets. Children were told not to speak the king's name aloud, for fear the very whisper might summon punishment. Harold received reports of these operations with a detached satisfaction. He asked no questions about methods, only results. To him, Each disappearance was an invisible thread cut from a web of imagined conspiracy. The fewer threads that remained, the safer he felt, though safety never truly arrived. In one village near Hexham, an elderly reeve tried to plead for leniency on behalf of several men accused by local informers. When Harold's soldiers learned of this intervention, they returned under cover of fog, dragging the reeve from his home and executing him behind the churchyard wall. His death was recorded as natural causes, though every villager who washed the blood from the frozen stones knew otherwise. As the purges intensified, clergy across the region began documenting the atrocities in guarded language. Monasteries often served as the only places where truth could survive, hidden between lines of scripture and prayers. One such chronicler was Brother Edsige, an aging priest who had spent 50 years preserving the histories of his people. Watching bodies pulled from rivers and ditches, he sensed a darkness settling deeper than any Northumbrian winter. At the close of the year, he wrote a single line that captured the terror more clearly than any detailed account. It was as if the king wished to erase the North one soul at a time. In an age where kings ruled with the sword, the church remained the one institution capable of restraining royal excess. For Harald Harefoot, this made the clergy not a partner in governance, but a threat. Their loyalty leaned toward tradition, toward lines of succession rooted in ancient English custom, not the hastily assembled legitimacy Harold inherited. Among the bishops, none represented this quiet defiance more clearly than Ælfwine of Worcester, elderly, respected, and openly sympathetic to Harthacnut's claim. Ælfwine had spent decades navigating the delicate boundary between spiritual authority and political expectation. He had blessed kings, negotiated disputes between nobles, and protected countless peasants from violent lords. But his commitment to moral steadiness placed him at odds with Harold's increasingly punitive reign. When Alfred Aetheling's mutilation became known throughout the church, Ælfwine had allegedly condemned the act in private conversations with fellow clergy. These whispers, some true and others embellished, eventually reached the king's inner circle. Harold viewed the bishop's disapproval not as a theological disagreement, but as sedition. He ordered Ælfwine summoned to London under the guise of answering ecclesiastical concerns. The bishop, fully aware of the danger yet unwilling to flee, traveled south accompanied by only a few monks. His frail frame and slow gait reflected both age and the heavy resignation of a man stepping toward a tribunal he knew was predetermined. The trial took place in the Great Hall of Winchester, though nothing about it resembled genuine judgment. Harold's chosen counselors filled the benches, their expressions arranged into stern, theatrical disapproval. Guards lined the walls, forming an unspoken reminder that the church held no authority here. Ælfwine stood alone, unarmed, unprotected, and dwarfed by the spectacle built around him. The charges read against him were sweeping and deliberately vague: conspiracy with foreign princes, incitement of rebellion, and undermining the authority of the king. No evidence was presented beyond anonymous testimonies, cited without names or context. When given a chance to speak, Ælfwine did not deny advising moderation or praying for a just ruler. He did not curse Harold, nor did he defend the political claims of Harthacnut. Instead, he spoke softly about the duty of shepherds to guide their flock toward peace and how the mutilation of a helpless prince had grieved not only the church but the kingdom. His calmness unsettled the court. Harold, seated above the proceedings, interpreted the bishop's composure as defiance. The king's jaw tightened, and with a curt gesture he signaled for the verdict. The counselors delivered it without hesitation, guilty on all counts. The sentence, however, was crafted with political precision. Not public execution, which might provoke outrage, but imprisonment under harsh conditions meant to quietly extinguish the bishop's life. Ælfwine was taken to a cold chamber beneath Winchester, a room originally built to store grain during siege years. There, deprived of warmth and denied visitors, he withered quickly. The monks who had accompanied him attempted to plead for leniency, but they were dismissed from the city under threat of arrest. Within weeks, Ælfwine's strength failed. His final days were marked by intermittent clarity, during which he scribbled brief letters on scraps of parchment describing his sorrow for England's suffering and his hope that future rulers might find mercy where Harald had chosen fear. His body was buried quietly, without the honors normally afforded to a bishop, yet his voice did not vanish. Before leaving Winchester, 2 monks secretly retrieved fragments of his final writings, hiding them within the bindings of hymnal books. These letters, carried in secrecy across the countryside, would circulate in whispered readings for years, not as calls to rebellion, but as quiet testimonies of a kingdom descending into cruelty. The death of Bishop Ælfwine marked another step in Harald's transformation. He had silenced the church not through debate, but through force. And in doing so, he revealed that the throne he fought so bitterly to secure was no longer upheld by law or loyalty, but by fear. A fear he demanded, yet could never fully escape. When Alfred Aetheling was carried into Ely, the monks barely recognized him as the young prince whose arrival had once symbolized hope for the restoration of the old royal line. What they received instead was a body already fading, a man maimed beyond recovery, and a symbol transformed into a warning. His injuries, the mutilations ordered quietly and carried out brutally, had turned his very presence into an indictment against Harald Harefoot's reign. Yet the monks, bound by vows, tended to him with the same solemn dedication they offered every soul entrusted to their care. They placed him in a small chamber near the infirmary, a room warmed by a single brazier and perfumed faintly with wax and herbs. Brother Godric, the infirmerer, tried to clean the wounds that refused to heal, though every touch drew involuntary tremors from the prince. Alfred could not see the faces around him, but he recognized the hush of monastic life, the rhythmic prayer, the quiet shuffling of sandaled feet, the low chanting drifting through stone corridors. It was a cruel irony that the monastery he had sought for refuge would instead become the place where he awaited death. The monks understood within days that Alfred would not survive long. His breathing remained shallow, an infection had spread through his body with unrelenting speed. Yet even as he weakened, Alfred attempted to speak. His words came fractured, often lost in the space between waking and fevered confusion, but they revealed a young man trying desperately to reconcile the violence inflicted upon him with the world he had expected to inherit. He asked whether London still remembered his father. He wondered if his brother Edward would ever return. He whispered fragments of prayers learned in childhood, clinging to memories the darkness had not yet extinguished. The monks answered gently, offering comfort rather than truth. They did not speak of the court's silence, the noble's fear, or the ease with which Alfred's enemies had erased his claim. Brother Oswy, a scribe with a steady hand and a heavy heart, often sat beside him through the long nights, recording the prince's moments of clarity. In one such moment, Alfred murmured that England felt like a house with its doors torn from their hinges, a place where anyone might enter and claim what once belonged to his family. Oswy preserved these words, sensing they carried the weight of a fading lineage. Outside Ely's walls, news of Alfred's condition spread slowly but with profound effect. Some saw in his suffering the end of the old dynasty. Others viewed it as a martyrdom that exposed the cruelty of the new. But for Harald Harefoot, the prince's impending death was not a tragedy, it was an inconvenience resolved. When word reached the court that Alfred's life hung by a thread, Harald reportedly offered no reaction, neither relief nor regret. The absence of emotion itself became a grim commentary on how far he had drifted from ordinary human feeling. On a winter morning, after weeks of agony, Alfred's breathing grew faint. The monks gathered, chanting softly as his life slipped away. In his final moments, he reached out blindly, seeking a hand to hold, and Brother Godric placed his own in the prince's grasp. Alfred exhaled once, long and trembling, and then lay still. That afternoon, Brother Oswy wrote the final line of the Ely Chronicle's entry on Alfred, a line simple yet devastating in its restraint. Thus ended the hope of many. By the time rumors reached London that Harthacnut was gathering ships in Denmark, something in Harald Harefoot had already begun to fray. The king, who once moved with brisk competence, now paced his chambers through entire nights, rubbing his temples as though trying to force clarity back into a mind clouded by dread. His attendants learned quickly that fatigue sharpened his temper. A servant who dropped a cup was dismissed and never seen again. A clerk whose handwriting displeased him vanished before dawn. These were not dramatic punishments but quiet erasures, mirroring the covert purges he had unleashed across the north. The councillors, once bold enough to debate policy, now chose each word with the precision of men stepping across thin ice. Harald interpreted hesitation as conspiracy and enthusiasm as deceit. Letters arriving from shires or foreign courts were opened in his presence, then analyzed obsessively. If a greeting lacked warmth, he suspected coded defiance. If a phrase seemed rehearsed, he assumed treachery. Messages intended for him were sometimes intercepted and confiscated without reason, only to be forgotten on tables cluttered with other unopened scrolls. Information no longer guided him, it overwhelmed him. Sleep eluded the king almost entirely. He lay awake in the small hours, listening for footsteps outside his door, convinced that an assassin dispatched by Harthacnut crept through the palace. Physicians offered herbs to calm his nerves, but he refused them, accusing the men of plotting to dull his senses. The flicker of torchlight against the stone walls, once a comfort, now drew his gaze in sudden alarm. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him with purpose. The court adapted to his volatility, though adaptation often meant retreat. Nobles invented excuses to leave London. Bishops shortened their visits. Even his personal guard rotated their watches reluctantly, each man fearing that the king's suspicions might turn on him. Yet Harald did not isolate himself out of cruelty alone. Burdened by his own decisions, he could no longer distinguish truth from the noise inside his head. He sensed that he had crossed lines that history would not forgive, and this knowledge, more than any imagined threat, hollowed him from within. In one incident whispered about for months afterward, Harald stormed into the council hall clutching a torn letter intercepted from Kent. The message contained nothing more than a routine inquiry about taxation, but the king's voice trembled as he accused the ealdorman of coordinating a rebellion. When the councillors hesitated to support such a charge, Harald slammed his fist on the table, shouting that every man present was lying. The meeting dissolved in stunned silence, each participant leaving with the quiet recognition that their ruler was no longer governed by reason. As days passed, his physical appearance deteriorated. His eyes grew sunken, his movements jerky, his breath heavy as though he carried an invisible weight that pressed deeper with every decision he made. Meals went untouched. His hands shook when he tried to hold a cup, and at times he spoke to himself in short, sharp whispers, rehearsing arguments no one else could hear. Even his most loyal supporters attempted to steady him, but Harald recoiled from their concern, convinced that sympathy was merely a disguise for betrayal. Eventually, illness followed the exhaustion. Fever gripped him without warning, leaving him drenched in sweat and gasping for air. He dismissed the court physicians, insisting they sought to poison him, yet he lacked the strength to rise from his bed. The final days of winter found him confined to his chamber, clinging to consciousness as though the kingdom itself depended on his refusal to rest. And thus, before Harthacnut's fleet even touched English waters, the strain of kingship, and the fear that shadowed every decision he made, crushed the man beneath the crown. Harald Harefoot's final days passed quietly, not with the grandeur of a dying king, but with the muted struggle of a young man worn beyond recognition. The fever that had plagued him through the winter deepened, draining what little strength remained in his restless frame. Courtiers moved through the palace on softened footsteps, speaking in murmurs as though the very sound of their voices might shatter what remained of his fragile mind. His chamber, once guarded with fierce suspicion, grew still. He lacked the energy to accuse, to rage, or to command. Instead, he lay staring at the beams above him, his breath shallow, his thoughts drifting somewhere. No counselor, no soldier, no mother could follow. No chronicler recorded final words. Some later claimed he whispered calculations about Harthacnut's fleet, others that he murmured prayers learned faintly in childhood. But most believed he said nothing at all. Silence had become the companion he trusted more than any living soul. And so, in March of 1040, at roughly 23 years of age, Harald died. Suddenly to some, inevitably to others. A young king consumed by fear long before illness claimed his body. When the news spread through London, the reaction was unlike that given to other kings. There was no wave of public weeping, no crowds pressing at the palace gates to glimpse the bier. Instead, the city responded with a strange, unsettling quiet. Shopkeepers continued their work. Fishmongers still shouted their prices, though even their voices seemed muted. It was as if the entire capital exhaled a breath it had withheld for years, unsure whether grief or relief was appropriate. Only in private did whispers rise, that the pitiless king had finally met the same cold end he had dealt to others. Harald's courtiers followed tradition, preparing his body for burial and choosing a modest resting place. Some expected that the turmoil of his reign would end here, with a simple interment and a cautious transition of power. But fate and Harthacnut had other plans. The returning son of Canute, long plotting to reclaim the throne he believed was his by right, arrived in England soon after. He entered a kingdom still trembling from Harald's rule, and the air grew tense as old loyalties resurfaced. Harthacnut did not wait to reclaim authority. Upon reaching London, he ordered an inquiry into his half-brother's actions, less a legal process than a declaration of vengeance. The accusations were numerous: unlawful executions, dishonoring royal kin, and sowing fear among subjects who should have found safety under their king. Yet the most chilling act of retribution came not against the living, but the dead. Harthacnut commanded that Harald's body be exhumed. Soldiers carried out the order with rigid obedience, though some crossed themselves when the coffin emerged from the earth. The corpse, already pale and diminished, seemed smaller than the King London had once feared. There was no ceremony, no prayer. Under Harthacnut's orders, they dragged Harald's remains through the streets and cast them into a marsh near the Thames, a gesture meant to strip him of dignity, legacy, and the sanctity granted even to flawed rulers. The people watched, not with joy, but with a grim recognition that a cycle of vengeance had simply shifted hands. A reign defined by executions ended with one final humiliation, delivered by a brother who believed justice required degradation. And thus, Harald Harefoot, king, usurper, son shaped by fear, left no monument, no treasured chronicle, no aftermath whispered by future generations. Only an unmarked marsh, a reputation carved from cruelty, and a cold reminder that power held through terror leaves behind nothing worthy of remembrance.